Welcome to the STARS program, seniors taking active roles in society. And now, here's your host, ANITA FINLEY.
Good morning, Darwin.
Good morning, Anita, and I am delighted to hear that you were not washed out to sea.
Right. No, that's true, but at least Staten Island didn't have any problems. My goodness, I heard that we had a problem now over there in North Carolina on the ocean.
Oh, yes, but I used to write a book on the Bahamas, and I've been looking at the devastation on Grand Bahama Island and Abaco, and I just don't know where the people will go. Anyway, that has just been terrible. But
it has been.
You're safe, and I am here in Staten Island with my winter sweater on. The cold winds are coming in
really?
from Canada.
What's the temperature down to?
Oh, I don't know. It must be 58.
Really?
But
that's interesting because, you know, Darwin, I'm going on a press trip the end of this next week, and it's Wisconsin, and they said it's going to be cool.
Yes, well, you've had wonderful hot summers, so you'll welcome the change. I'll get right into things because so much is happening around here.
Okay.
The Burt Reynolds book came out. Your copy is on the way.
Great.
And this is of the appropriate time because yesterday, this is the first anniversary of his death. And the title is Burt Reynolds, Put the Pedal to the Metal. Subtitle, How a Nude Centerfold Sex Symbol Seduced Hollywood. And I told you last time we talked that a British company is making a story of his life, and the film crew just left last week. They came here for Danforth Prince, your friend and my publisher, is one of the main narrators, and they did a wonderful job of exploring his life on film, and now they're in pre-production. So a book and a movie. And I understand that Lonnie Anderson, the second wife of Burt Reynolds, is now reading an advance copy. God knows what her reaction will be. You remember Lonnie Anderson? Hello?
Of course. Of course I do.
Yeah, and so she is still alive. And now, first, to get into Burt Reynolds.
And a lot of women wanted to do that.
Burt Reynolds was a creation of Burt Reynolds. The caricature of himself that he often did in films had very little to do with the man himself. He created the character. And I'll explain real quick how he did it. He did it because of a chance weekend he spent with Marilyn Monroe in the 1950s. A friend, he was a bouncer at the time at Roseland, the largest ballroom dancing center in Manhattan. And a boxer and a fellow bouncer there asked him if he would pick up Marilyn Monroe at the Actors Studio and take her home because he was going to be tied up. And as he was walking along the street to the Actors Studio, this woman, walking beside him, he turned, it was Marilyn Monroe, who was already world famous. And he explained who he was, that he was going to meet her and take her home. And he said, you know, I thought you're walking in the Times Square area. I thought you would be mobbed. And she said, oh, do you want me to become Marilyn Monroe? So she took the scarf off of her head, fluffed up her hair, heavily coated her mouth with lipstick, and he said almost within 3 or 4 minutes, a mob had formed. She became Marilyn Monroe.
My goodness.
And that gave him an idea. I saw him night after night on Johnny Carson's The Tonight Show, and Burt Reynolds invented the character of that he often played, like in Smokey and the Bandit. In real life, he was a very troubled, very sensitive man, and who had a great deal of trouble controlling a temperamental outburst that often became violent. You had his life. To borrow a line from Charles Dickens, it was the best of times and the worst of times. He just went from the top of the mountain to the lowest part of the valley. It's in many ways it's a tragic life, and I'll just review some highlights. For 5 years, he was the top box office star in the world, and for 10 years, one of the top 10 box office stars. And for baby boomers, he was very important because he was the first superstar created by baby boomers. Up to then, our parents had Gary Cooper, John Wayne,
right.
and they were always on the side of the law. But baby boomers were very defiant in the 70s. For those of us who survived the 70s, let's congratulate everybody. Well, it was right. CNN has been running a series on the 70s.
Oh, I've loved that, Darwin. Absolutely love what CNN's been doing with the 70s, 80s, 90s, 2000. What a job.
Oh, yeah. Well, and I also understand that 14 known published writers are doing books on the 70s. It was the most incredible period. I mean, I lived through it, running all over the world and Hollywood and New York, and I mean, it was outrageous. It was, again, the best of times, the worst of times. For example, I had 5 cars stolen, 28 robberies, 2 small apartment buildings set on fire. You entered New York at your risk. This was before Rudy Giuliani came in and cracked down on crime, and Burt Reynolds, in his movies, he played someone running from the law, usually Jackie Gleason and those Smokey and the Bandit. And so the baby boomers sort of saw him fit into the era. And it was just, rampant sex. People said in New York you couldn't take the subway to work and walk down the street without people having a quick one in the doorways. I'm not exaggerating. It was just, the disco, Studio 54, it was a wild time. And Burt came along, and unlike the heroes of yesterday, he captured the imagination of the baby boomers, and they flocked to his movies. And I met him. Actually, I used to work, I think I told you this, for the Miami Herald in the
of course.
Palm Beach and Fort Lauderdale.
Sure.
And Burt was well known in that area. He was a football player. He nearly killed himself. He couldn't go to the grocery store 1 block away without going 100 miles an hour. And then he one time ran under a trailer truck, and which took off the top of his car, and he buried himself under the wheel, and he survived that night.
Oh, I didn't know that.
They had to cut out his spleen. And then he injured his legs. He wanted to be a football hero, and he was lured into acting. And he struggled for years. He said, I had to play those damn Indian parts. Actually, he was part Cherokee on his father's side. And he has this reputation of being a good old Southern boy. And, of course, you, of all people, know he lived in Jupiter, Florida.
Yes, in fact, Bill was involved. I think we talked about this once before.
Yes.
He had that actor's rep thing there. Was he a good actor, though, actually?
Well, as he said, if I weren't a good actor, I was the best damn Burt Reynolds there ever was. Yes, he was. He showed it in certain dramas. But this leads to, first, to correct his birthday. He wasn't a good old son. He said he was born in Waycross, Georgia. He was born in Lansing, Michigan. But he said, I didn't want my fans to know I was a Yankee.
Oh,
but
my.
Of course, then he was mostly associated with Florida, as you so well know.
Right.
The one thing he did do all of these terrible movies that just made millions. And he made 3 horrible mistakes career-wise. He turned down James Bond.
Really?
And it went to Sean Connery.
Would he have been a good James Bond?
Well, he wondered about that because he said he thought it should not have been played by an American. I mean, the scriptwriters could have written something why he was an American was a British agent, but anyway, he turned it down, lost a fortune, and he turned down Han Solo in Star Wars, which made millions and millions for Harrison Ford. And the one role, he wanted to do something more serious, but he turned down Terms of Endearment with Shirley MacLaine.
Yes.
And the role went to Jack Nicholson and brought him an Oscar. And but his great role was, which was shot in Northeast Georgia, was Deliverance. I don't know. You may have seen it.
I didn't see it purposely. It's too scary for me.
Yeah, it really was. And he nearly killed himself because he insisted on going over the waterfall and he nearly drowned. He was washed half a mile. He emerged nude. The current was so strong that it even ripped off his clothes and practically broke his spine. But he survived. And he said later, I would have won the Oscar, but it came out at the time I posed nude for Cosmo for Helen Gurley Brown, and his nude centerfold, of course, became notorious. And he said, I signed over my rights, but then I would go check into a hotel and see the sheets had my nude centerfold. I look at the shower curtain. He said, Helen Gurley Brown made millions. Incidentally, he wasn't the first choice. Helen went to Paul Newman, Warren Beatty, and a Florida resident named Joe Namath. And all of those guys said, no, Helen, no. And anyway, he felt it made him a sort of a caricature. But the thing that is, he had 2 marriages, and the first was to Judy Carn, the British actress. Now, I'm sure people listening remember her from the Rowan and Martin Laugh-In, where she was the sock it to me gal, and she would get a pie in the face or a bucket of water thrown into her face, and it was a disastrous marriage. She didn't tell him that she was mainly a lesbian, and he had been on location, and he came back to their home one afternoon and found her in bed making love to 2 women. So he got a clue that she might like women more than men. And they carried on for a few more months of their marriage, but it ended in divorce. And he would be more famously associated with an older woman, the America's Sweetheart, Dinah Shore, one of my favorite singers. Some people say 20 years older, but I would count it 16. Dinah always objected to it being called a May-December romance. She would prefer May-September romance. One thing that I discovered, because I knew a woman named Miss Betty Davis, and she told Tennessee Williams and me one night, she said she had an affair with Burt Reynolds in the 1960s. And they were both leaving the same building in Los Angeles, and he had admired her greatly. In fact, he later wrote about her in a book about famous people. But he was fascinated by Betty Davis, even though, talk about an older woman, but they connected, and their relation, I don't mean their romantic relationship, their relationship as friends then lasted until Miss Davis died. And a lot of people don't know that. They associate him more with these beautiful young women like Farrah Fawcett or Catherine Deneuve, who was voted the most beautiful woman in the world. He had a flings with Tammy Wynette and a brief fling with Dolly Parton, and he certainly did get around. But when asked who was the great love of his life, he said it. Dinah sure became my greatest friend, but Sally Field, and they met on Smokey and the Bandit, and she ultimately left him because he couldn't stop having affairs with other women. He said, I just can't control myself, you know. Well, many men have said that, I'm sure, right?
Yes, that is true, but that's too bad because he loved her, but not enough, huh?
Yeah, but he said, my worst mistake, he lived with Lonnie Anderson for 4 years before marrying her. And he said, I don't know why I ever married her because I didn't like her. So I thought that was a very unusual quote. Lonnie, forgive me if you're listening to this. And the tragedy of his life, his best friend was Clint Eastwood, who, by the way, is still working in movies. I just saw his last movie, and I tell you, I admire Clint in the sense that he believes on carrying on until the very end.
Okay.
And he's not looking so great, but anyway, he's still making movies. And they made a movie called City Heat in 1984. And some stupid stuntman picked up the wrong chair. It was supposed to be one of those sort of easily breakable wood. He was supposed to hit Burt over the head with it. And he picked up a steel chair, and he cracked Burt's jaw.
Oh.
Well, this turned into a disaster. He went to doctors, including some in Palm Beach and some in Los Angeles, and he couldn't really chew, and he had to drink a liquid diet. He lost 50 pounds. Well, all of this occurred when the world heard that Rock Hudson, former box office star, had AIDS. It was at the height of the AIDS epidemic. People were terrified. And, of course, tabloids ran, Burt Reynolds suffers AIDS. He didn't have the AIDS. He had a broken jaw. But he was living with Lonnie Anderson at the time, and she came home in tears. She said her hairdresser wouldn't do her hair and her manicurist wouldn't do her nails because she was living with a man who had AIDS.
How sad. That's sad. You know, Darwin, before you continue, I failed to tell everybody your name before we got on there. Darwin Porter, who is a famous author, celebrity expert, and he's calling in from Staten Island. Okay, you can go, but I felt I needed to do that.
Well, he gradually recovered and got it. He found a very expensive doctor in San Diego who got his jaw adjusted. But you know, some people who have suffered from that disorder have committed suicide. You literally can't. You're in constant pain. Regrettably, even though he got the jaw eventually 2 years later repaired, he became addicted to all sorts of pills, and he was in and out of rehab, including some in Palm Beach, and so he never really got over the addiction. And it was made worse because he insisted on doing his own stunts. And so, I mean, he almost, he just wrecked his body, but that was his choice. And not only that, he made millions of dollars, but he made bad investments in Florida, in Arkansas, where he got involved with a couple called Bill and Hillary, and in Texas. And he opened something called Poor Food, Poor Foods Restaurant.
I remember that. Yes, I do know that. And that didn't work, did it?
Yeah, it didn't work. In fact, it was for those people who really like, hog jaw and collard greens and pinto beans. It was real authentic. But at one point, it was losing $1 million a day. And, of course, even a millionaire couldn't afford that. And so he went through all of his money and declared bankruptcy. And divorce came with Lonnie, and the divorce was played out in front of the nation. It was just tabloid stories every day. He's accusing her of infidelity. And the only thing they got out of it, they adopted a wonderful son named Quentin, who is still alive today. But it was a horrible, messy divorce. And I think the saddest thing that happened, it occurred in Florida, where he had to sell his tokens and souvenirs. He even had to sell his football trophies that he earned in Palm Beach. But he said something. He said, well, I'm just so glad that people still remember me and are willing to pay money for a trophy I won when I was 18 years old. And I thought that was a sort of pleasant way of handling a humiliation.
Well, before we run out of time, I do have a question. When I went to the Jupiter Theater, the Burt Reynolds Theater, he always had a picture of his mother up there. Was he very close to her?
He was very close to his mother. Her name was Fern. She was one of those Gothic America creatures, stern but loving of her son. His father, though, I think he, in the end came to love him, but his father was so firm. He was the police chief of, I'm sure you've been to Riviera Beach.
Yes.
And he was the police chief of Riviera Beach.
Really?
Yes, and he wanted Burt to become a policeman, but he said his father never really showed him the least bit of affection. Once when he was talking back to his mother, his father knocked him across the room, and he fell into a closet with pots and pans raining down, and so his father believed, in fact, his father locked him up in jail one time. So his father called it tough love.
Right. Well, I was curious about that. Well, Darwin, I can't wait to see your book. I know it's going to be explosive and it's going to be very popular as everything else you do. And now on to other things. Can you tell us what you're working on next?
Yes, I am. I've got 3 or 4 things. First, my whole house is being disrupted Monday. A large British-French film crew come in. They're making a movie here called The Dream Eater with there's a child star in it, all sorts of things going on. It's the 7th movie made here this year.
They've discovered you, Darwin.
What's that?
They've discovered you.
Yes, well, they discovered the house.
I know. Well, I'm sure that Danforth is having fun with all this.
Well, yes, he did such a brilliant thing on narrating the Burt Reynolds. I was very proud of him, and I am beginning work on my book I told you about, the first book ever written on Judy Garland and Liza Minnelli, and the film called Judy with Renee Zellweger opens September 27th across the nation. It's the story of the last days of Judy Garland, and
this is the last second of Darwin Porter, and I have to say goodbye, and it's been wonderful, Darwin. We always learn so much, and thank you, and I'll talk to you again.
Anita, and stay safe, okay?
And stay warm.
Okay.
Okay. All right, bye.